We're going to get started in this morning's message, and it's in line with a series that we started several weeks ago called Cruciformity. And what we've been talking about is how you and I enter into the spirituality of the cross. And we're using that language very specifically because we're talking about how we live our lives as a result of what we believe. When Jesus was introducing his disciples to himself, he was not introducing them to a way of thinking. He wasn't introducing them to a set of theological ideas. He was introducing them to a way of living, following him, and then following what was later called the way. And it is a way of life that is the byproduct of what we believe. If we believe certain things to be true about the cross and about Jesus, well, then that has implications on how we actually live. And that thing that we're doing is called spirituality. And so we are entering into the spirituality of the cross. Now, there's really four movements to this series that we're kind of working our way through. And it really began at the heart of who we are as individuals, and we talked about having a cruciformed identity, that this starts with something that happens inside of us, and then that begins to shape how we live towards others around us, starting with the way we live towards God, then how we live towards others around us, and then how we live towards culture or the context that we find ourselves in, even as specific as creation. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff in the next several weeks. But for right now, what we're talking about is our cruciformed faith. We're talking about what it looks like to have a faith that is characterized by this idea of cruciformity. Now, I'm going to just say something that's been interesting over the past several weeks. I've had a number of people come up to me, and this often happens. I get feedback from people around sermons, and usually it's pretty good, and I ignore the stuff that's bad. But I have people come up, and they're like, "Hey, Brad, this series, this message, or what, this is really," and then they pause, and I'm like, "Uh-huh," and then they say, "It's really good," and I'm like, "But," and inevitably everyone keeps saying, "But man, it is really tough to hear right now. Like, it's really good." In fact, I've had several people say, "I needed to hear this." Like, not I wanted to hear this, I needed to hear this. And there's a reason for this, and the reason is really that around this whole idea of cruciformity, that word itself sort of seems to encapsulate a lot of ideas that are counterintuitive to the culture we live in, that we would transform our lives or conform our lives to the image of a cross, a symbol of sacrifice. But even the language that we've been using as we've moved through this series has been very challenging. We talk about emptying ourselves. We talk about losing our lives to find our lives. We've talked about dying to self. We've talked about sacrificing for others. And so all of this, because it's so counterintuitive and countercultural, I think it causes us to say, man, I think I need to hear this, and this is good for me to hear. As a Jesus follower, I need to press into this kind of faith, but at the same time, this is challenging me to step into something a little more deeper and a little more meaningful. Now, I mentioned that because today we shift just a little bit, and today there's a bit of a change, because today we're going to understand that sometimes seeking under the banner of this cruciformed life is actually met with finding. So I know that sometimes we follow Jesus, and it frequently means that we're going to lay down things, but in this case, it also means that unlike Bono, we actually find what we're looking for. Like, we don't have to sing that song the rest of our lives. We can actually find what we're looking for. And specifically, we can find it as it relates to a cruciformed faith. And I want to just dive into this topic today by just sharing something that's really fascinating, just a little detail, a little statistic that I think you're going to find really interesting. If you Googled Wall Street Journal and the word soul, don't do it now. I know some of you are like consummate fact checkers. There's always like, by the way, I check my facts all the time because I know there's somebody out there who's like, "Oh, really?" And they're on their smartphone. We're going to put a blocker in here. But anyway, so if you Google Wall Street Journal, WSJ, and the word soul, you will be shocked at the number of articles that come up where the title of the article, written by some author, some journalist at the Wall Street Journal, has included the word soul in the title of their article. Now, this is sort of an interesting thing when you think about it, right? Because the Wall Street Journal is predominantly a publication that is writing about world events, but from the perspective and to the audience that is seeing things through the lens of business and finance, right? That's the Wall Street Journal. It is predominantly about money and about business, which should cause us to question a little bit, why in the world would a publication that writes from that perspective include the word soul so frequently in the titles of their articles? Here's the answer to this. This is unbelievable. The editors of the Wall Street Journal discovered that they get more clicks if it's an online version, or they get more reads and comments from a printed version, by 15% more if the title of the article simply has the word soul in it. Isn't that interesting? So they have a level of readership that they've identified. This is the number of articles that get read. There's a percentage of that. And if the article says soul, those articles are read 15% more than any other article that's written. That's fascinating, isn't it? Really fascinating when you start to think about it from the perspective of those who read the Wall Street Journal, right? Because not to insult those that read the Wall Street Journal, we had a few people raise their hand in some other services today, and I'm not going to call you out on this one, but typically we think about somebody reading it. It's not somebody reading the journal, opening their computer on a Saturday morning over coffee, right? It's usually somebody who's fairly focused, somebody who's analytical, someone whose head in the moment they're reading it is focused on business. Probably somebody sitting in their office, they've had something sent to them, or they're looking online specifically for things. And yet even that analytical, business-focused group has a tendency to read an article on the soul more than every other article, which is really interesting. So if these jaded business people are more interested in the soul, what does that say about the rest of us, right? Kind of an interesting thing. Why is this the case? What this is revealing is that there is just a general hunger that exists inside of human souls. There is a general hunger. Generally speaking, most people have a hunger deep inside of themselves that is very real. Real enough that just an article saying soul causes them to go, oh, I think I want to read that. Kind of interesting, isn't that? It's a general hunger that people have. The problem is this, that for most people, the hunger in their soul is vague. For most people, this hunger, this longing is so vague, it's so nebulous, they can't really give language to it. It's not like on the body part list of a human being, the soul shows up. And so we don't really have language for the things we feel. We just have anecdotal evidence that we know it's there, right? We do things like this. And so we have very vague understandings of our soul, and even more difficulty trying to satisfy what our souls are actually trying to say to us. And so we go, yeah, I know I have a soul, and it seems to be drawing me towards something, but for most people, we're clueless about how we actually resolve that. How do I actually answer this deeper thing that's going on? By the way, that right there is the difference between people who have cruciformed faith and everybody else. Cruciformed faith isn't characterized by sort of a nebulous understanding of spiritual hunger or the soul. Cruciform people don't just acknowledge, yes, I know this is here. Cruciform people don't just say, oh yeah, I know that there's a spirituality. They specifically understand that their hunger is pointed in a particular direction. Cruciform people hunger for God, not just general things. They specifically hunger for God. And do you see the difference in that? It's not just that they hunger, it's not just that they have a soul, it's that they hunger for God. Cruciform men, cruciform women have this very specific hunger, and they understand it's a hunger that's aimed at God. And so today what I want to talk about is this hunger for God as it relates to cruciform faith. As we live towards God, are we hungry for God? And how do we know if this hunger that we have is really genuine? Are we actually beginning to move in the right direction with this? And I say that because for me personally, there are times when I wander away so easily, and sometimes my questioning becomes so vague, and sometimes I get a little lost in all of the chaos of life, that I want to know and understand myself. Am I moving towards a faith that is genuine and real and truly the cruciformed faith that Jesus is calling us to? So this morning what we're going to do is we're going to dive into this topic, but we're going to do it in a very interesting way. And rather than just sort of look at the the concept of hungering for God from the outside, I want us to get inside of a person's experience, and specifically inside of a person's experience who actually hungers for God in a way that's been authorized, and we've sort of been pointed in his direction as this is what it looks like to hunger for God. So what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through a specific psalm, Psalm chapter 63. It's a psalm that's written by a guy named David, who back in the history of Israel and the history of humanity is a very real person. He was a very real king, and he had a very real life that he was living and talking about. So as we begin to get into that, let me just explain a couple things about the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is a lot like a journal. Those of you that journal, you know exactly what I'm talking about because you journal. Those of you that make fun of people who journal, you know what I'm talking about. A journal is where we have conversations on paper that if we had them out loud, we'd probably be incarcerated or something, right? Like you process life in your journal, like I'm so angry with or whatever, like, you know, or you just talk about this is what I'm experiencing and why do I feel this way? We sort of dump things out. Or sometimes we talk to God in our journal, like God, you know, this or that. We kind of like process there. The Psalms is essentially a journal. Most of the Psalms are written by this guy named David, not all of them, but most of them. And it really serves as his just processing. This is my life and this is where I am. The difference between David's journal and my journal is God actually wants you to read his journal. God doesn't want you to read my journal, otherwise it'd be in the Bible, right? So in fact, you'd either be bored or scared, one of the two if you read my journal. But David, it's like God says, I approve this message, right? So I want you to read this guy's journal, but I approve of you reading this. And here's what's really, really beautiful about this. There is nothing about David's life or even what he says that makes you think that he's worthy of us reading his journal. In fact, there are circumstances that David walks through that are incredibly complicated and messy and far messier than some of the things we will ever see in our lives. And some of the stuff that David says, it's shocking. I mean, it's actually scandalous. Some of the stuff that you hear David like saying to God, you're like, oh, what? Are you allowed to say that and not get struck by lightning? Like, there's that kind of stuff that happens. But then not only that, David writes when his life is in circumstances that are very similar to ours. And when I say that, I mean David goes through seasons where things don't go his way. Can I get an amen to that? Right? You've all had a season where like nobody seemed to be rolling out the red carpet for you everywhere you went. And it seemed like every day you woke up, somebody should be, but they weren't there. And so your days were miserable and you had difficult times, right? Day after day, year after year, maybe sometimes. That's sort of where we find David. He's in a very real season, a very real struggle. And yet in the middle of this, we actually see David hungering for God in a way that I think is meaningful, and it speaks to our present circumstances in a way that I think we can hold on to in a very, very powerful way. So Psalm 63, we're going to start reading in verse 1, and we're going to see some principles. If you want to take notes or think through some of these things, I encourage you to do that. But he says this, he begins this, he says, "Oh God, you are my God, and earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, and my flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." So this language, as poetic as it is, obviously it's connecting to his soul, right? This is deep, like earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts, my flesh faints. All of these are describing something deep that's taking place, right? This is a real desire. And then notice it's really interesting who he's actually seeking and who he's thirsting for and how he describes it. He says, my God. He says, oh God, you are my God. Now, before you think David is like overly possessive and claiming God for himself and not us, I want you to think about how you use that term. Whenever you say my, and then you fill in the blank with a title or a name, what does that seem to indicate about that person or that relationship? You say my, when you say my, you usually say it like about, well, my mom, right? Or my dad, or my brother, or my friend, or my physician. I don't know, maybe you use that word in some different ways, but you use the word my, and when you use the word my, what you're describing isn't possessiveness, you're describing depth of relationship, right? If it's my, well, there's a level of connection. There's something deeper. It's not just possessive. It's that we have sort of a covenantal relationship, right? There's a closeness to this. There's a confidence in this. That's essentially what David is saying. He's saying, you are my God. Like there is a closeness. There is a relationship here that is meaningful and powerful. And because you are my God, I'm going to seek you. I'm hungry for you because you're my God. Now that seeking, I think, reveals something we got to stop right here and recognize and sit in for just a moment. They're close. They're in relationship. But the very fact that David is saying this is that not in his present experience. Do you see that? Like, God, you are my God, but right now it doesn't feel like you're here. I think that's an important thing for us to acknowledge. So David misses God. He misses God. And one of the first indicators that we're really engaging in a cruciformed faith is that we actually miss God. If you miss him, it's real, it's authentic cruciformed faith. If there's a sense of longing, it means you're actually moving towards the cruciformed faith that you've been created for. I think it's fascinating that oftentimes what the Bible describes is not people just sort of like seeking God and then finding God. Oftentimes what the Bible says is that people find God and then they seek him. Like, this is a repeated pattern. Like seeking God is the result of God finding you first. Like, God finds you and you have an encounter and experience with God, and then you spend the rest of your days saying, God, I want to experience you. I want to be in your presence. I want to know you because you've introduced yourself to me. See, people have spiritual hunger in general, but cruciformed individuals, they aren't like the folks in Acts 17 we read about in the New Testament where they just sought all of these spiritual entities to satisfy. No, cruciformed people understand that their hunger is aimed at the God of creation and Jesus himself, specifically. And the sense of absence, the sense of dissatisfaction with his absence exists in a person with cruciformed faith. Like, that's the evidence, like, this thing is real. Like, when you feel like you miss God, that's like somebody saying, like, that's legit. You miss God, that's good. Like, it's good to miss God. I think that's an interesting concept in itself. Those of you that know me, you know I have 3 daughters, and that basically means I have been outnumbered in my house for years. Like, for years. So, and not only that, because, I've got my wife and these 3 daughters, that's 4 women. Right now, my mother-in-law, she lives with me, that's 5. And then we have 2 dogs that are both females. And, basically, I just live in a river of estrogen. That's what I live in. Like, it's like La Casa de Rio, whatever estrogen is in Spanish. That's what our house is, right? So that's just kind of where, that was my lame attempt at Spanish, by the way, right there. Only time I've ever done that in all my years of ministry. So anyways, I just live in this world where I'm always outnumbered, and it's always trying to figure out, I don't know how to, I honestly, there are times I just feel helpless. I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know, I don't know anymore what to do. And when I get to that point, sometimes Sherry just goes, I think you need a break. I think you need some guy time. And I'm usually like, what's guy time? I don't even know what guys do anymore. I know we mow the lawn for the ladies that live in the house. We fix the cars for the women that live in the house. I don't know what guys do, right? And she'll remind me, just go away. And so she is really awesome. Now that I think about that, maybe that's not such a good sign. But anyways, that's a whole other sermon. So she'll be like, hey, you need to go. And it's so cool that she does that. And I will go, and I'll go sometimes I go play golf with somebody, or sometimes it's a couple of day trip or whatever. But here's what's really interesting. As crazy as I might be in the river of estrogen that I live in, inevitably I will be an hour into the drive. I'll be just minutes away and heading in this other direction. And I can just honestly say to you, I will start to ache for them. And I will, every time I say, but I don't want to leave. I don't want to go. It sounded exciting a day ago, but now I just want to be with you guys. I miss them, and I've just left them. That's what David is describing here. David is describing that, God, I miss you when you're not with me. that's when you know this thing is cruciformed. And then secondly, you know it's really authentic cruciformed faith when you don't just miss him, but you actually go look for him. So going and looking for him, that's real cruciformed faith. Like you actually do something about this deeper longing that you have. So let's look at verse 2. He says this, the next verse, I miss you. And then he says, so I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. Now, I want to just draw the distinction between where David is now and where he probably began this journey in his life. In fact, let me just say, it's very different from where most of us begin our journey. For most of us, when we first begin, we take our first steps of faith toward Jesus, usually it's because we need something. That's usually how this whole thing begins. It's because we want something in life and we hope that like he's going to be good enough to provide it for us. And so maybe it's just, you know what, God, I need intellectual certainty about my future. And so we create this idea like, God, just give me certainty. Or, God, I need a particular kind of peace for very specific circumstances. And so we go to God because we want peace for these circumstances. Or maybe it's a little more shallow than that. Maybe it's just like, God, I could use a few extra bucks. And so we go to God because we need a few extra bucks. And so oftentimes, we just move towards God because we need something. But those are not signs of cruciformed faith. Cruciformed faith means we are going after him, not hoping that we get what we want, but that we get his presence. That's the difference. A cruciform faith is genuinely looking for him, is looking for his presence around us, not just for the benefits of finding him. Not just for like, oh, there's going to be this side benefit. Like, for example, when my girls come to me and there are these moments where they have these like really forced smiles and like, hey, Dad, I was wondering, and they're like really sweet or like I can usually see through their manipulative efforts, right? And I know like they're getting at something. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? You know it. I know it. Guess what? God knows it. God knows it. When we're coming to him, we're like, oh, God, I love you so much, right? He's like, what do you want? What do you want this time, right? But that's not what we're being drawn into. I love this quote from Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards says, the mark of authentic spiritual experience is that you become satisfied with God for who he is and not just the benefits that he gives you. If you miss him, if you love him, that's real. And then third, the way we understand cruciformed faith is this, and it's if you understand how his love connects to the life you're really living, that's authentic cruciformed faith. You miss God, you pursue God, but then you connect the love of God with what's really happening in your life. Like the things that are going on, the desires, the cravings, the hungers that you have, you begin to connect those things. That's when we begin to move even closer to a cruciformed spirituality. It's where the rubber meets the road. Let me just read for you verse 3 of Psalm 63. David says, because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. I think David, maybe at the beginning, it was about the stuff. It was maybe primitive and a little simplistic. But when he actually experienced God, he now says, God, your love is better than life. Like if I have your love, that's life. That is life. I don't want anything else. And he rests in God for who he is and nothing else. So any of us that have ever experienced this, if you've ever gone down this road, if you've ever found God, you had a particular moving moment where you were content in his presence, you know what David's talking about. It's like, wait a second, I actually just like knowing you and don't need you to do anything for me. That is better than life. So maybe you listen to this and you go, okay, wait a second. I don't think I'm quite as hungry as David is. I don't think I have a hunger for God that way. And yet maybe you also say, but I want to have cruciform faith. How do we move in the direction of increasing our appetite for God and moving towards cruciform faith? It's really interesting that the last section of Psalm 63, David gives us an example of some of the behaviors that he engages in that I think cause his heart to hunger for God the way that he does. Listen to verse 4. He says, so I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. when I remember you upon my bed and meditate you in the watches of the night. Let me just tell you something about when David is writing this. The context for this moment is that David has lost his kingship. The context for this moment is that David is in fear of his life, and he's had to leave the city that he once called not just his home, but the center of his own kingdom. He's living not in a literal wilderness, he's living in a physical wilderness. He has lost everything that is material, and I guarantee he is not sitting at a king's feast night after night eating steak and potatoes. Like, that is not what he's having. And yet, listen to him. I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food. In other words, God, I'm more satisfied with you than I would be with the food I used to have in my kingdom. When I remember you upon my bed, where is his bed in this moment? It is a wilderness. It's a grassy patch with a rock for a pillow. And yet he says, in the moments when I'm meditating on you in the watches of the night, that is what brings me life. See, cruciformed faith is when you start realizing the only thing that's going to satisfy the craving of my soul is God. That's cruciformed faith. When you begin to realize, I have cravings, but God, you're the one that will satisfy these things that are happening inside of me. I know in our house, for the last 15 years, there's this conversation that we've been having. I say conversation because it was only an argument the first 5 years of this 15 years. We've been married for over 20, but there was this thing that started happening where I started noticing that dinner was creeping up in our house earlier and earlier. Like, I'm not kidding. For a few years there, I thought we were going to end up at the Old Country Buffet at 3:30 in the afternoon. Because I was like getting home from work and like everyone's cleaning up the dishes. Like, what's going on? And so there was this thing about dinner time. Like, when is dinner? Like, when are we going to eat dinner in our house? And so a lot of times it's like at 5:01 in our house, which usually I don't leave the office till 5:45, so that's problematic for me, right? So I remember Sherry and I, we've had these conversations really over 15 years, like, hey, do you think we could have dinner like at 6? Because some people eat dinner at 6 o'clock. That'd be good, you know? And so we've had this conversation, and time again, it always came back to the same thing. She would say to me, the amazing mom that she is, she would say, listen, the girls come home from school in the afternoon, and they're hungry, and I don't want them filling themselves up with a bunch of junk and then not eating a good, healthy dinner. That's another way that all of our moms said to us, you'll ruin your appetite, right? Isn't that the same thing? You'll ruin your appetite. That's the same sort of idea. Let me just share this with you. I think one of the reasons that we aren't experiencing the hunger for God, one of the reasons we are not more passionately pursuing God's presence, is that we are letting other things ruin our appetite for Him. I think the stuff on our tables is ruining our appetite for the good food that God's wanting to give us. I think the broken patterns of behavior that we just keep leaning into and chasing, it's ruining our appetite for God. I think our obsession with being entertained and always having something to do, something to occupy our mind and our time, I think it's ruining our appetite. We self-medicate, we self-prescribe, and we get hungry, but we fill ourselves up with junk. And so when the steak and potatoes and salad of God's goodness and His presence end up on our table, we look at it and we go, like we might be this morning going, you know, you're right, I need that. That's what I actually need to be consuming. I need God's presence. I need something good to fill my soul. But I am so sick and full of junk that I can't take one bite. Cruciformed faith sees our hunger, sees the way we're just ruining our appetite and says, no more. I'm going to lean in and wait for the good stuff that God gives that truly satisfies my soul. We read verse 7. David continues. He says, for you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. I love this because he uses past tense. In the middle of some difficult circumstances, he uses past tense terminology. You have been my help. What is David doing? He's going back and he's telling stories, right? He's telling stories of things that have happened in the past to remind himself of what God can do in the present. I don't know if you've ever noticed when you tell a story about somebody, and they're not with you in a moment, like you're telling somebody, like my friend Chad over here. If I tell you a story and I go, oh man, there was this one time that Chad and I, we were doing this, and I tell a story. Have you ever noticed you do this, and then like a day later, you're like, man, I kind of miss Chad. Like, there was a really great time. And so then I end up calling and saying, hey man, been missing you. You're like, oh, why? I don't know, you came up in conversation the other day, right? I tell a story about good times with Chad, and it makes me miss Chad, right? The same thing happens in every other relationship. When I tell stories about good things that happened in my marriage in the days past, in these days, it's like, man, God does good things through our marriage. And when we tell stories about the good stuff God's done, it does good for our souls in the present. When you and I tell stories of God's faithfulness, and we're not out of bitterness and not out of anger, not saying, oh man, I wish we could go back to the good old days, but when you just go back like David does and remind yourself and say, man, God, I remember when you did this, and I believe that now I can rest in the shadow of your wings in the present, because in the same way I didn't see it coming then, I'm sure you're going to do some things now. You want to stir up your hunger for God. Remind yourself in a healthy way of the good things God has done in the past in your story. And then finally we see this, verse 8. He says, my soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. In these final verses, what David is describing is his dependence on God's presence. Like he's saying, literally, God, I need you with me. When my girls were young and they would go to dance competitions or soccer games or sing in choirs or stuff, they would ask me this question. They would say, hey, Dad, it was really casual, but they would say, hey, Dad, are you going to be there? And as a dad, every time I could, I always said, yeah, I'm going to be there. Why? Because for them, my presence matters, right? It matters. Now they're jaded. They could care less if I'm there, but it mattered at one time, and that's what I'm holding on to, right? Presence matters. And I just want you to know that your Heavenly Father feels the same way about you. Your Heavenly Father looks at you no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, and when your soul longs and says, God, are you going to be there? God says, I'm going to be there because my presence matters. That's what Jesus was saying to his disciples. One of the last conversations he has with his disciples before the crucifixion, Jesus is talking to them. And in John 15, we read this passage that describes the need for God's presence. He says this in verse 4. He says, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I'm the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Cruciformed faith just says, God, I acknowledge I need you. That'll make you hungry for him. Let me close with this quote from Dallas Willard. He says this. He says, God's presence is everywhere around us. God is able to penetrate and intertwine himself within the fibers of the human self in such a way that those who are enveloped in his loving companionship will never be alone. This morning, we're going to close by taking communion together, and I think it's such a beautiful way to express our faith and our hunger for God. And here's why. In just a moment, you're going to be holding in your hands a little piece of bread and a little cup, and I have never heard anybody walk away from a Sunday and go, man, I am so full from communion today. And no one's ever said that I know of, right? I can't go to lunch today because, boy, that wafer was extra big today. Which is an interesting statement, isn't it? It's the statement about symbolism. It's a statement about what matters. I think it's fascinating that hunger and thirst are so primal, and yet it's hunger and thirst that Jesus leverages to show us what will really satisfy us. He uses food and drink to say, do you understand that what you really need is me? And that ultimately is what will sustain you. And so this morning, I'm going to invite the ushers to distribute the elements. And as they do, I want to encourage you to just take the elements and hold them in your hand for a moment. We're going to actually take them together after the band sings. And I want to just encourage you this morning, would you consider where is the level of your spiritual appetite? Where is the level of your hunger for God? Are you hungry for God? And maybe it's time to just have a conversation and say, yeah, you know what, Lord, I want to increase my appetite. You can pray, you can sing, you can just think about these things. In a few minutes, we'll take communion as a congregation together. May every one of you be men and women who earnestly and honestly hunger after God. Amen. Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for being here today. Looks like a beautiful one out there. Enjoy it. Enjoy each other. Talk to some friends. We'll see you guys next Sunday. See you later.